I'll be just sharing a few thoughts on the path of the Baha'i community, but from the central figures, so from the time of the Bab and Bahá'u'lláh until today. Just thinking about the promise of the message. Oh, I'm pressing the wrong button.
Use the arrow.
I'll use that. Perfect. So as we've kind of seen this quote today several times, but it says that for the first time in history, it is possible for everyone to view the entire planet with all its myriad diversified peoples in one perspective. World peace is not only possible, but inevitable, and hopefully not in the sense that we heard from the UN. But so what enables this to be inevitable? We heard about the story that Caleb just shared of this narrative of religion throughout time, and really we're all part of a story between God and man. It's an unfolding story, and it's quite difficult to capture just in a few minutes. So I was thinking, well, how do I approach this? And I thought of a family member who once said to me, you know, Ashkan, when I'm giving a talk, I just say a prayer and I turn to Bahá'u'lláh and I just, whatever comes to me, I share. And this was before he spoke at a wedding, and it was the worst. He somehow brought the barb and garlic and onions into the speech about his getting married. So I thought, you know what, I'm not going to take my chances. He's very spiritual and I want to learn a lot from him, but I'm not going to do that today. But actually, where do we turn to if we want to summarize anything? Like, where better than the writings, and actually the writings of Shoghi Effendi. So in 1953, on the 4th of May, in the second Intercontinental Conference to the All-American Conference, Shoghi Effendi wrote about a process in which he delineated 10 parts, essentially the process of growth of the spiritual conquering of the planet. And in 1950, he'd actually mentioned this same process without mentioning that there were 10 parts to it. So I'm just going to look at these parts and split them up and just zoom through the first few and focus on the last ones, because that's where we are. So this is directly from this letter from Shoghi Effendi. At the start of the paragraph, he says, "Then and only then will the majestic process set in motion at the dawn of the Adamic cycle attain its consummation. A process which commenced 6,000 years ago with the planting in the soil of the divine will of the tree of divine revelation, and which has already passed through certain stages and must needs pass through still others ere it attains its final consummation." So in the first part of this process, this is straight from the passage, the first part of this process was the slow and steady growth of this tree of divine revelation, successively putting forth its branches, shoots, and offshoots, and revealing its leaves, buds, and blossoms as a direct consequence of the light and warmth imparted to it by a series of progressive dispensations associated with Moses, Zoroaster, Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, and other prophets, and of the vernal showers of blood shed by countless martyrs in their path. Really, I think this ties to the apocalyptic, what you were just sharing about the apocalypse and previous revelations. And we know, Lindsay shared a bit about it, but in some answered questions, Abdu'l-Baha talks about that we're in a universal cycle. So we have the cycle of prophecy, which is all these manifestations before, and now we're in the cycle of fulfillment. And both are part of the universal cycle, and Baha'u'lláh is the universal manifestation. And there'll be many more manifestations that come under the shadow of this cycle. And this is the context of which we live. This is why also we're here today. So then Shoghi Effendi says the second part of this process was the fruition of this tree that belongeth neither to the east nor the west, when the Bab appeared as the perfect fruit and declared his mission in the year 60 in the city of Shiraz. So that's the Bab's declaration, which we could say a lot about, but unfortunately I won't. And then the third part was the grinding of the sacred seed of infinite preciousness and potency in the mill of adversity, causing it to yield its oil 6 years later in the city of Tabriz. So if we think about the story of the martyrdom, it's inspiring people today and all the heroes associated to that time. So this is the third part. So the first part of this process is 6,000 years, and then the 6 years of the life of Bab, the declaration to his martyrdom, is parts 2 and 3. And then Shoghi Effendi goes on to describe the fourth part was the ignition of this oil by the hand of providence in the depths and amidst the darkness of the Siachar of Tehran 100 years ago. So when Baha'u'lláh received his revelation, that is the fourth of these 10 parts of this process. And the fifth was the clothing of that flickering light, which had scarcely penetrated the adjoining territory of Iraq in the lamp of revelation after an eclipse lasting no less than 10 years in the city of Baghdad. So if we think about the 10 years between the receiving of revelation up until the declaration in the Garden of Rezvan, we also see that Baha'u'lláh starts to pen, 7 values, 4 values, the hidden words, the Kitab-e-Igan. Even in the Igan, he conceptualizes revelation and the purpose of prophets. He says, it's not the object of every revelation to effect the transformation in the whole character of mankind. There's both inward and outward, this inward and outward, internal and external transformation. And he essentially then goes on to say that if there is no transformation, then the futility of the manifestations of God would be evident. So we also know that the purpose of Baha'u'llah's revelation is nothing less than the whole transformation of mankind. And this is essential if we're thinking about both the path towards peace and also our role. The 6th part was the spread of the radiance of that light, shining with added brilliancy in its crystal globe in Adrian opal, and later in the fortress town of Akka to 13 countries in the Asiatic and African continents. So during this time as well, we've heard today, like Baha'u'lláh wrote to the monarchs, he wrote to Queen Victoria, he said to them, now that you've rejected the most great peace, hold fast to the lesser peace. And he was writing the rest of his revelation, all the words that we're pondering today, many that are still yet to be translated. So we see that the 4th, 5th, and 6th part of this process, really, they relate to Baha'u'lláh receiving revelation in his life. And the first part is 6,000 years of manifestations of God. So it's obviously not equally divisible in terms of time, but this is how Shoghi Effendi described these processes. Does anybody know what the 7th part is going to be?
America.
So the 7th was its projection from the most great prison in the course of the ministry of the center of the covenant, across the seas and the shedding of its illumination upon 27 sovereign states and dependencies in the American, the European, and Australian continent. So yes, the spread and also the life of Abdu'l-Baha. So we know during this time, the life of Abdu'l-Baha, he himself was a practitioner of peace. We heard some glimpses into that earlier from Ruhi. But he also penned the charters of the Baha'i faith, the tablets of the divine plan, and the will and testament, which essentially are foundational if we think about the direction of the Baha'i community in terms of the administrative order that we're building and continue to build today, and in terms of the diffusion of the word of God. So if we think about Abdu'l-Baha's passing, really the time if you think about the 2nd stage of the process, when the Bab declared, that's when Abdu'l-Baha was born, wasn't it? And then to 1921, we have parts 2 to 7 in, let's do the math, 77 years. The first part was 6,000 years, part 2 to 7 was 77 years. So now we go on to the time of Shoghi Effendi. So the 8th part of that process was the diffusion of that same light in the course of the first and the opening years of the 2nd epoch of the formative age of the faith. Over 94 sovereign states, dependencies, and islands of the planet, as a result of the prosecution of a series of national plans, initiated by 11 national spiritual assemblies throughout the Baha'i world, utilizing the agencies of a newly emerged, divinely appointed administrative order, which has now culminated in the 100th anniversary of the birth of Baha'u'llah's mission. So this is in 1953. So at this time, the formative age, and we'll have a look at it, was at some point, was in the 2nd epoch, And so in 1953, when Shoghi Effendi wrote this letter, we'd seen the first 7-year plan to the Americans was in 1937, and the objectives of that was to have a local assembly in every state, to develop the Wilmette Temple, and to start spreading the faith in Latin America. And we start to see diffusion more and more. But the tablets of the divine plan, really they were put into motion with a 10-year crusade even further. And so this is when Shoghi Effendi was writing. This is the context of that time. And so Shoghi Effendi goes on to say, the 9th part of this process, the stage we are now entering, is the further diffusion of that same light over 131 additional territories and islands in both the Eastern and Western hemispheres, through the operation of a decade-long world spiritual crusade, whose termination will, God willing, coincide with the Most Great Jubilee, commemorating the centenary of the declaration of Baha'u'lláh in Baghdad. And I'm sure many of you either may know people who pioneered during that time, and the 10-year crusade, really that was when pioneers arose all over the world, and the UK community responded brilliantly, so much so that, I mean, I wasn't alive back then, but I heard that when the Temple for Europe was mentioned that it would be in Germany, the Brits were shaken. They said, why isn't it in London or Edinburgh? I mean, it'd be great if it was in Edinburgh. But so that was the response, and that was the 9th process. So this is when Shoghi Effendi wrote this letter. But of course, by the end of the 10-year crusade, he'd unfortunately passed away. So he also writes about the 10th part of this process, and he says, and finally, this part, the 10th part of this mighty process must be the penetration of that light in the course of numerous crusades and of successive epochs of both the formative and golden ages of the faith into all the remaining territories of the globe, through the erection of the entire machinery of Baha'u'llah's administrative order in all territories, both east and west, the stage at which the light of God's triumphant faith, shining in all its power and glory, will have suffused and enveloped the entire planet. So he talks about the penetration of that light in numerous crusades, successive epochs. So this is where we're at. We're in the 10th stage of the process. So we look at the 2nd to the 9th stage. It's quite a short period of time. And now we're in the 10th stage where generations will be born and will die, and it will have successive epochs. But the goal is penetration and suffusion. And Shoghi Effendi writes about diffusion, penetration, and suffusion. And so, I thought it would be helpful just to reflect a bit then about the direction of travel since then. But again, it will be a bit of an overview. So maybe also just a slide that just shows the epochs. I won't go into it too much. You can't reduce epochs into one line. I have done it, but you can't do it. But the first epoch, we see there's about the administrative order. The second epoch we start to see the spread of the faith and the rise and consolidation of the world center. And in the third epoch, 1963 to 1986, and the promise of world peace was in 1985, that's when the faith started to emerge from obscurity, and we start to see social and economic development projects. The Office of Social and Economic Development was initiated, which is now the Baha'i International Development Organization. And then the fourth epoch, this was the first time that national communities started to take on responsibility for their own goals. And if we're thinking about penetration, and we want to establish peace, we need to go further and further to the grassroots. So this was such like a signal development for the Baha'i community. And it was also during this time that we started to see some patterns emerging in the Baha'i community. There were two patterns, and the Universal House of Justice described this in their 2023 message that marks the 100 years from the passing of Abdul-Baha. That's great for tracing the path, by the way, of the Baha'i community from Abdul-Baha to now. And they say, by the mid-90s, there are about 180 national assemblies. There'd been a tripling of national assemblies. There'd been, I think, in the 2-year period in the 1980s, 1 million people embraced the faith as well. But two patterns emerged that they noticed based on the response of the wider community. And one was communities that were strongly consolidated. They had a unified vision, they had strong Baha'i identity, but they could not serve as a pattern for remodeling, like a restructuring of society. Because, how is it possible? If you're just a small group, you might be able to be very united. Your debates at feast, the only disunity might be how long, to have a devotional or not. But then you get confronted by a society out there that's full of people of all different walks in life. Like, how is it possible? And then the second pattern that emerged were communities where sometimes maybe even hundreds of thousands of people became Baha'is, but they just weren't able to consolidate them. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the time, the systems in place, the experience. So this was noticed in the 1980s. So if you think about this document as an apocalypse where there's change, actually the Baha'i community noticed this in the 90s, and the House of Justice realized we need to learn about this. We need to do something about this, change the course or the direction of the community. So in 1996, they said the next 4 years will represent an extraordinary period in the history of our faith, a turning point the epochal magnitude. And in that same message, and when we look back, we can see it so clearly now in 2025, can't we? They say, thus this plan acquires a special place in the scheme of Baha'i and world history. Those of us who are alive to the vision of the faith are particularly privileged to be consciously engaged in efforts intended to stimulate and eventually enhance such processes. So the aim of this plan was the advance of entry by troops. I was very young then, but I remember like people kind of were thinking there might be a moment where, you know, the year 2000 will come and the masses will enter the faith. I think my father-in-law was saying when Gorbachev sort of embraced some of the West, people thought the promise of world peace has stimulated that. Now we are on the path to peace, but it is not going to be achieved through geopolitical means. It needs to be achieved by the transformation of hearts. And that is why the Universal House of Justice said, you know, they brought in the training institutes, and at this time they said, experiment, creatively experiment. In Century of Light, they later go on to say, well, you know, in the book it says, throughout history, the masses of humanity have been at best spectators to the advance of civilization. And even manifestations of the past have, because of different reasons, they've failed to kind of achieve peace. And in that same passage, they say Baha'u'lláh has come to enable like everyone to be freed from that bondage, but it requires the involvement of every single person on the planet. You know, Baha'u'lláh says all have been created to carry forward an ever-advancing civilization. We heard earlier that there is no us and them. Like this plan and these plans is for everybody. And the whole purpose of the Institute is to enable every single person to take the word of God, that you can see it today, and you can put it into action, to generate knowledge, to serve, to use the writings and to transform. And it has to start with the hearts and minds of individuals, because it's not happening at the national, international level. We see the challenges, we've heard the challenges. So this was kind of the turning point. And actually it was in 2005 when the Universal House of Justice said, in 1996, we knew how effective the Ruhi Institute was, but we didn't have the conviction to feel that there was enough experimentation to suggest that, or enough experience to say that the world has to adopt the Ruhi Institute. But that time has now come. The councillors, national assemblies, everybody has seen the impact of the training institute, the Ruhi Institute, sorry. And that's when they started to encourage the worldwide community to use the Ruhi Institute. So then just why the Ruhi Institute? Like what are some of the pedagogical principles that enable us to build communities using the Ruhi Institute? So one is that it's based on two kind of bodies of knowledge. One is the word of God itself. The other is the experience of the Baha'i community, which if you think about, like, is a very scientific thing, because we have a theory or we consult, then we take some steps and we reflect. And that's happening globally. And we're learning from a global process of learning, of putting the word of God into action. And so this is the two bodies of knowledge that the Institute's dependent on. The other thing is the word of God is at the heart, but it's also based on service. It's worship and service. So when I was, you know, younger, which was 5 years ago, you know, you'd often go to things that'd be wonderful, and there's still a place for this, but often we'd be kind of recipients of information or knowledge. But the Institute is there to help everyone be an active agent and a generator of knowledge. Like there's a big difference. It's like with anything. You can watch football or basketball, but it's not until you're playing that you can really learn with some level. And then if you're being taught and you're connected to a system of training, that's how we really develop our capacity. So every single individual has a role to play in the generation of knowledge, and that's what the Ruhi Institute's about. So just thinking even like one example, because we're also not a community of just theory, we're a community of theory and practice. But last week, somebody in this room met somebody at a birthday party. It was not a Baha'i related thing. And they started talking about service. And yesterday they met for coffee, and immediately after, this person was teaching a children's class for them. And, you know, also the beauty is that that person's in this room, but it could be anyone, it could be any of us, because everybody has that ability with this the Institute process. And that's the purpose of it. Another principle is that it's there to build capacity. And the House of Justice say that we're not just concerned with building our own capacity, but also the capacity of others. So the purpose of the Institute is for that, of serving society. and building our capacity to serve, building our capacity to apply the word of God. And we do it in the company of others on a path of service. And they describe, and this is another principle, that the path accommodates different paces and strides. So it's not something that is like a separate to what the Baha'i community is doing. It is the instrument of limitless potentialities. That's how the Universal House of Justice describe it. And it's also fine, like we've all had varied experiences with it, and that's also okay. You know, if my first experience with book one, my mum was my tutor, is the experience that I used to determine my relationship with it, I wouldn't be standing here talking about it. Well, my mum was a great tutor, but you know, I was 12 years old. There's no junior youth program. You know, it's a bit wild. I hope she's not watching. But you know, it's like if it's an instrument, like if somebody gives me a violin now and I just start playing it, it's going to be horrible. But if you give me 3 months, it'll probably still be horrible, but it might be a little bit better. But we're connected to a global system of learning. There are institutions, there are coordinators, there are people that assist us. All we needed to have is a humble posture of learning and a desire to learn. And for some of us, it's also okay not to focus on the materials maybe of the institute, but we can promote it and encourage others. And it's very clear when the House of Justice is also in their letters, they describe the progress of the world, where they see the greatest transformation. It's where the institute process is gaining strength. So these are some of the principles. As the word of God is at the heart, there's capacity building. It accommodates different paces of strides, and it's for all people, everyone. It doesn't matter where we're from. So, but there was another kind of concept that I thought would be helpful. So when we think about the series of plans in 2021, the Universal House of Justice says that their main concern is society building. So perhaps before we thought we were kind of involved in community building, but now our main aim is society building, starting at the grassroots. But of course, we have flourishing of institutions. We have the Baha'i international community. We have ISGP, BIDO, the BIDO, so many different kind of organizations in the Baha'i community that are learning about different areas of work. And the three main areas of activity we're engaged in, it's expansion and consolidation, social action, and discourses. And the House of Justice say they're all one, and that we are now concerned with society building. So this is penetration and suffusion, really, like how we go deeper and deeper is about society building. And we know that there are some communities where maybe we're still thinking about diffusion. There are pockets around the world, many of them where there are no Baha'is or there are no people engaged in applying the word of God at present. But there are also places in the world where there are many inhabitants engaged in this process. And the Universal House of Justice introduces this concept in the message to the councils in 2021 of prevalence. They say in some communities around the world, there is a degree of prevalence, there's such degree of prevalence that there is a transformation that's visible. The Baha'i institutions, they're a visible protagonist. All people are being influenced by Baha'u'llah's vision for humanity. So again, like for all of us and where we live, how do we, what are the steps to take towards that path? And maybe again, we're in places where not as much is happening, or we have to take simple steps. But how do we move towards prevalence? How do we learn about penetration, that the light of God suffusing the world, like flooding everybody around us? How do we see every single person as a collaborator, as a protagonist for peace? You know, it's not just, it's a lovely day today, and we're all inspired, and there's so much food for thought. But when we go home, are we seeing it with the person across the road, or our hairdresser, if you have one, or, you know, as somebody who we can talk to about building peace? And what does that look like? So here, oh, sorry, I'm losing my, the House of Justice in Merseybaum 2004 talked about the true practitioners of peace. And at the end, they say the methods and instruments of the plan allow every soul to contribute to a share of what humanity needs in this day. Far from offering a temporary salve for the ills of the moment, the prosecution of the plan is the means by which long-term constructive processes, unfolding it over generations, are being set in motion in every society. So we have these are the instruments and methods of the plan. And if you think about Baha'u'lláh, when he describes the purpose of religion, or the sending of prophets, he says they're twofold. One is the liberation of man from ignorance and towards understanding. And the second is the establishment, I'm paraphrasing, of tranquility and peace and the means as well, and delivering the means to make that enable. And is this not part of those means that we have the universal House of Justice? We have an instrument of limitless potentiality. We have institutions that guide us, national assemblies, many members are here. We're very fortunate to have that. We have our councillors and so on. But also, like, we have constant messages that are directing the community, learning from action. And so I think just for us, maybe just to finish, that really we're engaged in a process that started with Adam. It's gone through the Bab's declaration, his passing, his martyrdom, the life of Baha'u'lláh and Abdu'l-Baha. Shoghi Effendi is the guardian of the faith. And now we have the Universal House of Justice guiding the believers. And our object is more than peace. It's a spiritual conquering of humanity, really. And it's going to take generations and generations. And that's okay. Like, we can be relaxed, not too relaxed that we don't act, but we can be a bit relaxed because it's going to take generations. But we have at present an instrument that builds capacity in expansion and consolidation, in social action, in participating in discourses. And we're so blessed to have institutions. And maybe in future plans, those things will, how they manifest will change. And that's fine, because we'll follow what the House of Justice says, hopefully, and change with it. So it's just very brief. Yeah, I don't know.